Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to my presentation. I am Tania, Allard, and I'm a developer advocate for Microsoft, and I'm based in the UK. I'm going to be talking about good code documents itself and other lines, and this is about how we can start changing our organizational culture through documentation, and how we can also use docs to pay some of our technical debt. All of these slides are CC BY, so feel free to use, remix, and adapt as you see fit. And here is a link where you'll be able to access all the slides after the presentation. Cool. So just a little bit about me. I am an open source advocate, and I work at Microsoft with all of the open source communities, data science communities, and researchers. I also love complex systems. I have a background in research in this. And as such, I specialize in all things scientific computing and machine learning. And that aside, I also love mechanical keyboards. I like using them. I love assembling them. And I often share pictures of this on Twitter. Cool. So what you're going to take away after this presentation. First, an understanding of what is technical debt and how is that you probably acquired some of this in your projects or your organization. We're also focusing on documentation as an entry point to identify and pay this technical debt, and also some useful tips for you to use documentation to drive change within your organization, no matter how big your team is. So I'm just going to ask for a little show of hands of who likes writing documentation. I love writing docs. Now, who actually writes documentation as a regular practice? Let's say day-to-day, under normal workflow-ish sometimes? Cool. And what if I told you that you can actually change your work culture, your team cultures through writing more docs? Or writing better docs. And also pay some technical debt. I know this sounds a bit like a dream and like a wishful thinking kind of thing, but it's not. And let's start by identifying what is technical debt. When I think about this, I usually think about the monster that lives under my bed or inside my closet. We kind of want to believe it's not there, but we'd rather not look under the bed or open the closet in case it is actually a real thing. But it's very, very insidious. It starts creeping up little by little until it becomes a very, very big thing out of control. So basically, technical debt starts with a series of bad decisions that are eventually leading to our prone code or architecture. And such decisions can also lead to unnecessary use or bad use of certain resources. And these resources can be either infrastructural or people or other sort of resources. So whenever you start thinking about technical debt in your infrastructure or in your team, it's always worth to think, what were the decisions made in the past that prevent me from getting stuff done today? And for us to evaluate this, we have to also understand what causes technical debt. In brief, you and me. I would like to talk to any of you that have never contributed to any technical debt. And some examples in which we normally do this, or in which I have been gullible of doing this, is by favoring new shiny features instead of favoring tests or robustness in my infrastructure. Something else that massively leads and contributes to technical debt is time crunch. When a project or a new feature or a new release was due yesterday or is due today, and it's 4 o'clock in the evening. And when we start working on this time crunch, on these very short or tight or unrealistic deadlines, we start doing things like, I'm going to write this code, and then I'll come back and tidy up later, a week or a month later, and that doesn't happen. Or I'm going to come back and write the documentation later, and the docs never gets written. This is something that also happens a lot, and because I work a lot with machine learning, I'm going to use a machine learning example. Now, deep learning is very popular. Everybody wants to do AI. And some people want to use the latest trends or the latest algorithm because all the cool folks are doing it. Sometimes you can use a much simpler approach to get similar accuracy or similar predictions, but we don't do it, or some folks don't do it. That's also an example of technical debt, when we are favoring black box algorithms or very, very complex infrastructure to tackle smaller problems. Also, being in an already broken culture, when you're already working in an environment where everything seems to be a pile of garbage, it's very, very easy to think, if I add a tiny bit to that pile of garbage, nobody's going to notice. Am I right? Yeah. So how can we start identifying technical debts? What are those concrete little things that we'll see in our code bases or in our work that will point to technical debt? We already discussed it, the different decisions or the different social parts. But for example, one thing that clearly indicates this is code smells that are not necessarily bugs, but are indicators of deeper problems. So if you go to your code base and find a half-baked feature that was started probably 6 months ago, and nobody had time to go back and revisit and make it more robust or tighten the implementation, that's a code smell. If, despite of your code being on Git or GitHub, for that matters, you start seeing a lot of commented out pieces of code, that's also a code smell. And it also reflects with, well, I'm writing this piece of code or this function that will replace this other function, but what if I later need this previous part, but that never gets deleted? Also, when you go to your code base and don't find tests, or even worse, when you find tests that are broken and have been broken for a very, very long time, that's also a significant code smell. Multiple versions of your CI or your CD descriptions, but only one in use. I've seen this quite a bit where folks are using a certain CI or CD provider, and they update it, but then the old one gets moved to another directory inside the same repository where it's old CI or something of the such. Again, just in case they need to go back or flip back. And no documentation and poor documentation is also a very big indicator of this technical debt smells. When we talk about infrastructure, something that can also lead to this or indicate high technical debt is having this house of cards infrastructure, where if you move a tiny component of your infrastructure or your code base, all of the things that are around it will just suddenly start to crumble. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you've wanted to modify something, but somebody in your team tells you, oh no, don't touch that part, it just works like that, it doesn't need refactoring, don't touch it. Not even with a stick, don't look at it, just at all. Yes, I've been there. So that's also an INFRA smell, a bad one. And another indicator is that everything is on fire all the time. And sometimes we love, monitoring is good. Having monitoring and having tools in place to identify when something is failing in our system is good. But when we're getting alarms all the time that everything is on fire all the time, it's very easy to lose sight of what is really important and what is the really critical part in either our code base or our infrastructure or our products. And then it just seems that eventually, because everything is all the time on fire, you are living in the dumpster in fire. So not only everything around you is failing, but your team is constantly anxious, like that little folk in there. Also, for those of you that work more in a more data-intensive scenario, having unstable or underutilized data dependencies is terrible. For those of you that are not very familiar with machine learning, for example, when we're trying to do predictions, we tend to aggregate data from different sources. So that can be different APIs, different databases. But for us to be able to utilize this data, we need to do some transformation and some loading and make it accessible for other folks to use. So if down that pipeline you end up with 30 databases and you're only needing one, then that means that you're having 29 databases that you still have to maintain, that you still have to provision infrastructure, that you still need to do compute on to get to those, where you only need one. So that's also very, very bad. And pipeline jungles. This is very related to the previous one, where all of these dependencies or data dependencies become intermingled. So it becomes very hard to understand where the data is coming from and where it's going to. So you can't really understand how your data is being utilized or how to improve the performance of this data transfer. So now that we've covered all of these breadths of technical depth, which is easier to do when we are dealing with this phenomenon? Either burning everything to the ground, refactor your code base, or change your work culture so you stop pointing fingers. Who says number one? Number two, for those that love refactoring. And number three. No, it says easier. Now, which is more impactful to do? 1, 2, or 3? 3. It's, of course, the hardest one. It's the one that is going to take more buy-in from the different stakeholders, more time, and probably a lot of fights. So I'm going to start with story time, because we all love stories. And while you're at GitHub Universe, you're going down the sponsor booths, as we always do. We're gathering swag, like getting these new t-shirts and pins, and exchanging pins with folks. And you come up to this new booth that is labeled as the Wizard of Oz. I'm like, oh, okay, I've never seen this folk. So you approach the booth, and the wizard tells you he's going to give you a present. I'm like, oh, I like presents. I love swag. So this present comes with a set of rules or with a set of conditions. The first of this is that you have to build your present. You have to put all the pieces together. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm cool with that. I've built mechanical keyboards, and I write code for a living, so I'm cool with that. With no instructions. Like, well, there is Stack Overflow. I can do some internet searching. That's fine, I do that all the time. That's how I got a job. There are more catches, even. Some pieces might be missing. So as you're building your present, you'll have to build these pieces as well. Again, with no or minimal instructions. So because you're making this on the go with no instructions, some pieces might never fit. So you will have to use glue and tape and probably chewing gum to put them together. Which means that your present might or it might never work as expected. And the worst part, you're going to be miserable all the time. And this picture is a very nice representation. They're probably trying to put that piece of mirror on the ceiling and paste it with a piece of chewing gum, so the next time that you're walking near it, it might or might not fall into your head. So when you receive a present with all of these different gotchas, you realize that that's not a present. That's some sort of a curse. And what do you tell the Wizard of Oz? Go away, wizard. I don't want your curse. I don't want your present. So this is now replace the word Wizard of Oz by your manager or a senior colleague or your onboarding buddy. The present is your code or the code base that you are inheriting at your company. And all of these little gotchas, missing pieces, is all the technical debt. And the lack of instructions is the lack of documentation that we are facing when we are onboarding a new project. How can we counteract all of this frustration? One way to do it is writing the docs. And the other way to do it is make the docs valuable for the developers, for your team, for your customers. Docs can be part of your work. In teams where people were not writing docs, a way to force folks to start writing docs is making it part of the job. So no feature is complete or no new code base is complete if there are no equivalent comments or documentation to go with it. If you force this through using your CI and testing your docs and building your docs through your continuous integration or your continuous delivery pipelines, you're enforcing these practices. There is a bit of a trade-off here because it does work from the technical perspective, but also when you're trying to get your team to buy in, you will probably find a lot of resistance because nobody likes writing docs. So I'm going to give some tips later on how you can probably incentivize folks to write them. One of these is also when you're trying to write docs, especially for a library that you maintain or for a new feature that you're implementing, we don't like it because it feels like we have to do it. But if that's something that we have to do it, a good technique is think that your best friend is going to read. How do you want your best friend to be introduced to this new feature or to this new library? Be mindful. How easy do you want it to be for them to introduce and start using what you're developing? An example that is very well praised in the area where I work is AstroPi. A lot of folks praise how complete the documentation is, how good it is for onboarding new contributors as well as new users. And a technique that I really like from them is whenever they find anything that is confusing, or whenever a new contributor or a member identifies something that is confusing, they get the newcomers to contribute back. Because they have less of that expert bias than that the core team normally has. And by doing that, the team has also been able to identify some critical bugs and fixes for these bugs. Because once you understand and you're so deep into the code base, it's very, very hard to get rid of that expert bias. Something that is very important as well is thinking about the vocabulary and how we're writing this documentation. For many, many years, us as developers have used terms like master and slave. But this can be extremely complex in terms of power structures and inclusiveness towards our multicultural users and multicultural teams. So whenever possible, try to replace these terms for others that are more mindful and more inclusive. For example, a good alternative to master and slave is using primary or replica, or captain and sailor, worker and helper. The same when we talk about blacklist and whitelist. We can replace that with terms like deny list or allow list. And as you start using much more inclusive language on your documentation and be more mindful of both the people that are writing it and are reading it, you can also start having these conversations with your team, and your team will become much more mindful of those that are integrating your use base. If you don't want to manually go and check all your docs and all of your white papers for this incident, there are different libraries, and one library that will help you a lot to do this is called Alex. It's designed to catch these occurrences, for example, incidents of master and slave, and they give you alternatives for you to use that are more gender neutral, that are more inclusive, and you can use this from your command line, you can use this online. They have different implementations. If you use even Visual Studio Code, there is an extension for that. Also, when we're writing documentation, we have two levels, like two different strands of documentation. First is the comments or in-code documentation versus the public-facing or the user-facing. And here's where a lot of folks say, well, good code documents itself. You don't need to write the documentation. You don't need to write comments because documentation outdates easily and code doesn't. Some other folks say, well, if I don't write the documentation, I'm the only one who knows how this works. So they're never going to replace me. But the thing is, code tells you how you're doing that. How do you achieve a certain thing? If you're writing a function that retrieves data from a database and formats it in an appropriate, usable way, the code tells you how you're doing it. But the comments inside there actually tells you why. It gives a bigger clarity on your process of thought as you were writing said function or said method. And they describe your code to other developers, to whoever is going to take care of that code base later, whether that is your new onboard member or your best friend or yourself in 6 months' time. Documentation, on the other hand, describes this function or this method's functionality to your users. And as a guideline, when I try to write documentation and help folks to improve their documentation, I like recommending this that I call mindful structure. Again, its main goal is to get folks up to speed as fast as possible. You want to get your users to lower that adaptation or ingestion barrier and start using your product as fast as possible. So if you first start by explaining the feature, what is that it does, then describe some use cases, how people might be able to use it. When is this function or this method better than another alternative? If there is any additional recommended tooling, or any additional recommended imports. And also, common errors or common gotchas. This is something that is often missing in documentation. Or sometimes we update code bases. We forget to add these little gotchas on this is deprecated now, or this replaces that. So if when you're writing your documentation, you realize that you are struggling a lot to use this mindful structure, you might also find that you need to refactor that specific piece of code. Because if it's not clear how you would use it, when you would use it, and when you wouldn't use it, probably you need to improve that. And I've mentioned a lot of times already that your documentation helps your users to onboard, or to use your feature, or your library, or your package. But documentations also help your users to make the right choice. And you want this to be also smooth. You want them to use your product because it adds value to whatever they're doing, not because they didn't know better. But it's also a very good way to build trust between you as a developer and whoever is using your tool or is contributing back to your tool. And also give them useful starting points. Something that I've that I like a lot is when you can start seeing how other people are using that tool straight away and find a code or a workflow that will be parallel to yours. Also, when you're writing your docs, try to make the abstract tangible. Sometimes we like describing very complex architectures or very complex functions, but we could do the same or achieve even more if we added schematics that are easier to read. There are a lot of folks, especially like me, that are very visual, so if you were to give me a schematic like this that explains how 3 different packages or libraries interact together, I would understand it much more, much better and much faster than having this described in words. And also, trying to introduce the people again. Who's going to be using your tools? How do you think they're going to be using them? Sometimes we can't anticipate who's going to be using our tools. But if you have a persona and you say, well, for example, this developer, Jane, is trying to achieve that, you can also drive how your docs are being written to help onboard someone like Jane. And also think about design patterns. If you have a chance later on, Ines Montani gave a very, very good keynote at PyCon India. She's one of the founders of Spacey, that is a library for natural language processing. And I really like the approach that they use, where their library tries to give them the power to do NLP, but at the same time use the nicest features or the niceties of Python. So that way, not only they're using their library, but they're utilizing Python as a language without them having to spend a lot of time supporting little features that would marginally make the developers work faster, but will constrain them a lot. So also think of that, and having documentation about the limitations and how your tool integrates with other frameworks can be very, very useful. Again, on the road of manual docs, for many years, we've not had to write our documentation manually or separately from our code. If you're already adding comments, or if you're already adding explanation within your code base, there are a lot of libraries that allow you to generate literate programming or literate focused documentation. Something that I use a lot is Pyco, that is the implementation of Doco, because it gives you these very, very nice views of documentation where you have the comments in your code base, and then when you render the docs, you see all the different docs side by side to where in the code base that originates from. So this should become easier and more natural because, again, if you start enforcing this as being part of your job, being part of your pipelines, you don't have to do extra manual labor. It's already integrated as one of the automated checks or one of the checks that you run along with testing and building and deploying. So that way you ensure that as soon as you create a new release, the equivalent documentation for that new release is also up to date and it's also maintained. Now, something that I've worked on a lot with great success is having docs sprints. And this helps a lot with that notion of you're forcing all of a sudden your team to write docs. We organize a lot of code sprints, or we organize hackathons. Why not organizing docs sprint? Nobody likes doing it, but if you sit people together and schedule regular timings and probably bring traits like, I don't know, donuts or fruits or halloumi fries, whatever your team likes, then they feel like they are all on the same boat and they help each other. But also let them choose. Give them the freedom to choose on what documentation they want to start working on. In most cases, people are going to start working on documentation for features that they implemented themselves, but never had time to go back and document. If in your team you have both native and non-native English speakers or German speakers or French speakers, whatever your documentation language is, pair them together. So make it a joy of writing docs. And I really like this tweet from a book dash that we were running, where we were never expecting someone to come and say, I really, really enjoyed writing a chapter on linting. On linting, right? But when you set the right mind frame and the right environment, people can actually start enjoying writing docs. And just as important as it is to recognize those who contribute to your code, it's important to recognize those that are contributing to your docs. And that can be writing entire new pieces of documentation, fixing typos, and making it more accessible. Again, making it easier for those newcomers to onboard to your project. So why docs? Why do I recommend, and I've successfully used documentation to change culture? First, because the documentation is an open window or an open door to your code, to your code base. It exposes it to the world, but also it exposes your team culture a lot. Once you start integrating something that people don't really enjoy, like writing documentation, and start bringing the people back into the process, you're still and now placing your teammates and your developers in the correct mindset to be more mindful also about pull requests, or more active or more mindful when reviewing code. People also start becoming more mindful when you're doing the sprints planning, because then you have to factor in the documentation that needs to go in there, and the review of the documentation. They can also help you to expose those code smells and identify parts that might need refactoring or are not as usable as you would like them to. It also helps you to keep your institutional knowledge. So when that person that has not been documenting your code base for 8 or 10 months or 3 years leaves the company, it's because they decided to go to somewhere else, probably. But your knowledge and your code base is safe, and you can build on that. And you reduce that house of cards effect as well. And it also protects you against time churn. So in general, having all of this viewpoint on documentation as a first-class citizen in our code development also help people to be happier at work. And also helps your users to be happier when consuming your products. So both are more likely to stay around. So on that note, how do you start using docs to change your culture or to bring your people back into the process? Throughout this presentation, I've discussed 3 main parts, which is what is the technical debt, what are some practices for documentation, and how to integrate. So for us to be successful in this process, we have to first accept that we have a problem and stop pointing fingers. We're probably going to encounter ourselves in technical debt. A good exercise is trying to rethink about those bad decisions that led to technical debt, but not to point fingers at or blame someone, but to better understand how we can start repaying this debt. The second step would be to use documentation to to identify the suffering code smells and pay technical debt. Make sure that if you're using the mindful documentation structure, or if you are refactoring your documentation to remove non-inclusive terms, then also you might refactor some parts. And again, bring people back into the process and drive culture change. This is, again, the more you bring your developers into writing documentation, the more you bring the personas and the scenarios of your users into how to write documentation, you also put your users in the first stage, so you can develop features that will be useful for them and meaningful for them in the future. And also, people start becoming much more accountable. Your team will become much more accountable and start thinking about writing docs, saying no to time churn, probably saying no to unnecessary complexity. So if you want to try and drive change, again, is 1, identify and accept our debt, use the docs, and bring people back. That is it. Thank you very much. Get in touch. There is my Twitter. You can find me there on Twitter at Ishak. There is also my email. And the slides are going to be available after this session. If you try to go to the URL, it's going to give you a 404 at the moment. And I'm going to be also around GitHub Universe today and tomorrow. So if you want to talk anything about docs, CI/CD, and machine learning, I'm happy to talk to you. Thank you.